So thank you for taking the time today for the session. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters, Mr. Jim Giordano, President and CEO of CareTech Solutions, along with Mr. Jim Hunter, Director of Policy and Security with CareTech Solutions. Gentlemen?
Thank you, Lisa, and good morning to everybody. Wanted to mention that this webinar is coming from Troy, Michigan. We're a northern suburb of Detroit. If any of you have that question in your mind, how are the Lions doing this year, I'll just refer you to their record. Today we're going to talk about cybersecurity from a little different perspective. We want to talk about it from a governance perspective, or a high-level framework, if you will, that organizations should be thinking about. I currently sit on the board of directors for the Michigan market of the Ascension hospitals, and cybersecurity now is something that has really reached the board level. And I think it's important to from that perspective to make ourselves aware of the risks associated with that. So I wanted to just start out by saying. I went back to research this topic a little bit, and this is something I think you're all aware of, but we're seeing cybersecurity hacks really have taken on a whole new level. I wanted to give you just 5 of the major hacks in the last few years. Some of these are quite recent. iCloud on August the 31st of 2014. Apple's iCloud, and Apple, as we all know, pride themselves in their ability for security. They were hacked, and hundreds of personal pictures of celebrities were published. And some of these pictures were very personal. Jennifer Lawrence, who is one of the celebrities who was targeted for this, actually called this a sex crime and called for additional legislation in cybersecurity. In 2011, one of the most expensive hacks, PlayStation, was actually hacked, and it was caused to go offline for 23 days. It cost the company $1.2 billion in lost revenue and in damages from that hack. eBay was hacked in 2015, and approximately 233 million customers' records were compromised. And what's kind of interesting is that the reaction of what eBay had, they waited months to tell their customers. And when they did, it was a simple suggestion to change your password. Now, we all know healthcare is held to a higher standard, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Finally, 2 more quick ones. 8 hackers in New York City hacked 1,000 bank tellers' machines and withdrew $45 million in 10 hours. They had worldwide accomplices in this, and one of those accomplices was murdered in the Dominican Republic. Obviously, something went wrong internally with that black hat group there. And finally, one of the more notable ones was on July 15th of this year of 2015. Ashley Madison was hacked, and millions of site participants were exposed. In fact, I don't think I have to explain this, so what Ashley Madison's site was, but later, somebody developed a program that would allow you to have your contacts list checked against these people to see which one of your friends or relatives may have had their names in the Ashley Madison website. And unfortunately, the human cost of this was terrible. One priest and one policeman committed suicide when their information got out. So, cybersecurity is a big thing. It's a big thing now in healthcare, and from a governance perspective, it's risen to the point where we need to look at this. So, if I could just go back to the. Is that the first slide we have there? Okay, so why cybersecurity is a board issue and a leadership issue on this? And some of these things we've talked about. The financial and reputational loss is very relevant now from a fiduciary perspective from the board and senior leadership's level. Secondly, data breach laws make this a costly fine. As we said, the government holds healthcare to a higher standard, and the enforcement of this now is the enforcement is coming from these violations from the Office of Civil Rights. they have now put down, we'll talk about this in a little bit here, they've actually implemented some very expensive fines for some breaches, and they're sending a clear message with the dollar amount of these fines that if you don't comply, the expense is going to be very costly. We think senior leaders need to look at the consideration of cyber liability insurance. It's not, we're starting with this premise, it's not if you will get hacked, it's when you will get hacked and when there will be a breach in your security. So our organization's insured for this. We know from facts some of our customers, some of our healthcare customers, their operations have been significantly disruptive. We manage the IT environment for one large healthcare provider in the Detroit area that has a heavy population, a concentrated population, and they were hacked by Russia. They flooded their website, and access to their system by anyone was compromised, and it took us a few hours to get that under control. And the other point that I'll make is, as we evolve this business and industry, our buildings are becoming smarter. We're putting more devices on our EMR, which are hackable, and certainly that threat to medical devices is a real thing. So let's shift a little bit and see how boards are reacting to this. And it's amazing. This is information from a survey this year done by the Global State of Information Security here. You'll see some of these bubbles on the slide there. Only 40% of the boards say that they have looked at the overall security strategy. Only 36% said they've reviewed the security budget. Only 32% said they were familiar with the security policies. 25% said they were aware of the risk of cyber security and privacy risks. 24% were aware of the security technologies, the details of what was going on there. 18% said they reviewed the roles and responsibilities of the security organization, and only 15% actually reviewed the security and privacy testing. So, the inference there is that 85% of boards have not done all this. So it's just kind of interesting. I think this is a new area for boards. I can tell you from my board work, until I brought this up, we really hadn't seen much of it. The organization just haven't serviced it. So we talked at the beginning about some of these criminal attacks going on, but now in healthcare, for the first time, these criminal attacks are the number one cause of healthcare breaches. And if I asked you prior to that, what was the most frequent kind of hack, if it wasn't a criminal attack, what would that be? And the answer to this, I realize, unfortunately, this isn't a two-way conversation, but I'd ask you just to consider that for a moment. Well, I mean, those of us in the healthcare industry know it was internal lookups of celebrities that would come in. It was somebody checking on a friend, a family member, a celebrity, those kinds of things. But that's now have shifted. The majority of the hacks now come with criminal intent. In fact, if we look at how many attacks have occurred, this is the information that the government put out on the HHS website, that 90% had some kind of data breach in the past 2 years, and 40% reported that they had more than 5. And what's interesting, the organizations that were hacked and had a breach issue, the impact was $2.1 million. So big money there. And one of the things that is worthy, I think, of mentioning is, why would a healthcare record be of interest to a hacker? And the reason for that is it's just such a rich data set of information. I mean, all of us now, if you didn't know your mother's maiden name, we all know our mother's maiden name now, right? Because that is the number one backup security question, or one of those. We all know who our first pet was, our favorite teacher, etc. But because once you get a healthcare record, it's likely to contain the key into going deeper into an organization. Plus, if you think about it, it has a social security number in there. It has your address in there. It will have, in many times, a credit card. If you have a credit card on file to pay some of your medical bills and that. And even it has information which will allow these black hat hackers to get in and use that to get health services under a different name, under an alias, if you will. In one more slide here, I'm gonna switch it over to Jim Hunter, and he's going to talk a little bit more about this topic in that. But the final thing that I want to leave you with before I come back to you is that these breaches are expensive. In fact, the average cost was $398 per record, whereas the average cost across all industries for a breach is $154 per record. Now, that may not sound like much right off the get-go, but as we'll see in a minute, there have been breaches that have included millions of records. So you multiply that times the $398, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. So let me turn this over now to my colleague Jim Hunter. He's going to go a little bit further into data breaches.
Thanks, Jim. So what you see now on the screen, the FBI Cyber Division, they create these notifications that they call private industry notifications. And they can target a number of industries, healthcare being one of them. This one in particular was issued April last year, still holds true. But the goal here being that the FBI is trying to get some advance notice out to industry through these notifications. But basically, the pin that you see on the screen and the notification you see on there now, it really is kind of warning the industry as a whole that from their perspective and through their means of kind of overlooking all of the cyber attacks and things across all industries, that really healthcare is being put on the forefront. That they see the fact that there's a number of areas, including medical devices, that are really kind of putting healthcare in the forefront of this, and that cyber criminals are really going to continue to target the industry as a whole, given that there's a higher financial payout for all these medical records just based on what's in those records. And until recently, healthcare really, I think, was flying under the radar. A lot of the other industries, as Jim mentioned earlier, gaming and some of the social sites and things were targeted. But now healthcare data is really considered one of the top criminal targets by the FBI. And that 42% of those breaches identified last year really in the medical and healthcare areas. Again, the leading cause there, being hacking incidents. The takeaway from this really is just that healthcare as an industry as a whole is really the low-hanging fruit at this point. I think it's enjoyed some sense of coverage from other industries in years past in terms of them being targeted and not healthcare, but I think those days are over now. There's a number of areas that we'll get into where healthcare makes this a rich target in terms of the information it would keep. So leading into that, what makes our data so valuable? You think about what kinds of information are stored in most healthcare systems. You've got the financial side. We have that payer side for all these services that are being provided. So within that, there's credit card information, there's banking information, and then you get the medical information, and most included that names, addresses, social security numbers, all that stuff that really falls into the personal category as well as medical. And they can use this data really for a number of areas. Obviously you've got the insurance fraud and sort of financial fraud side of it. But as Jim alluded to earlier, even with the Ashley Madison breach, they can be used to blackmail people. They can be used, if you have someone who's influential in some industry or in some position, whether it's a politician, a leader of some sort, if they can get at that medical information, they can expose certain things that maybe they don't want exposed. And so the information, once it's gained, can be used for a number of areas, not just in the financial and sort of insurance areas that we think about. And the data itself sells, pretty expensively on the market, or inexpensively, sorry. You look at some of that credit card data, typically would sell for $1 a piece on the black market. The healthcare data, they can get anywhere from $50 up to $1,000, and really I think what would drive that is sort of the number of people that are in that data set and who they are. And then I think healthcare overall, just from the fraud detection area, it's poor. If you compare it to other industries like financial, they've got much higher detection, and they've had to evolve that over the years. So just some quick facts, just overall in terms of identity theft. That and this number increases really every month. I think 2.3 million people. I think many of us have had those letters come to our houses that so we've been unaware of potential breaches that have happened, and you'll get those letters sent, really informing you that hey, your information may have been compromised, may have been leaked. You get the offer for credit monitoring in some of the other areas, but in some cases that's not enough, especially if they've actively used that information. And so some of the statistics that we found that 65% of those victims had to spend their own money to really resolve the issues caused by this. It's not just enough to put a credit monitoring sort of Band-Aid over it from the victim standpoint. And if you get into cases where not only has your medical records been breached or potentially even been changed, that they can bring into safety issues as well. And so, the number of threats and things really has increased. I think, the insiders, those are the people really within the workforce, the people that, we work with in those organizations, they have access to these systems. And so, they can make mistakes and be a threat themselves, but more importantly, they can violate policies. They can snoop. I think we've all seen cases in the news where certain celebrities or someone's been, or politicians or other high value people have been admitted to facilities for certain reasons, and of course the human nature of snooping to find out why. It could be a neighbor, could be a friend, someone. Those also violate policies, and some may do it just not for criminal intent, but some may do it for that reason. So I think healthcare, just given the nature of what's going on and human curiosity, those create huge problems for the industry. I think the organizations that are kind of taking a forefront to it, through security awareness training. But that second bullet, the monitor, the manage, and the discipline, I think there's some very effective controls within there that, you make it well known within the organization that you are monitoring accesses, that if people are in these electronic, health record systems, they are looking for, matches on last name, matches on the same street, based on who the provider is that's looking in the system versus who the patient is, and broadcast that within the organization as well, that people know that A, you're watching, and B, you're doing something about it. If someone gets fired over that inappropriate access, it sends a pretty clear message to the workforce that that type of violation policy is one that won't be tolerated. Third parties as well present themselves a big risk to hospitals and healthcare organizations, and this is true across a number of industries. But I think healthcare themselves, they tend to have a lot of third parties. Whether it's the medical device manufacturers, vendors for these applications. Just contract employees as well can be considered, part of this third party. They are the number 2 leading cause for breaches. I think we've all seen cases, especially like with Target, where it was an HVAC, a heating and cooling vendor that they used their credentials to get into the system and really work their way from there once they got in. So, as healthcare organizations, you really need to manage those third-party risks. And how you can do that, there's a number of ways. Really, to start with is to look at what data they have access to. Is it PHI? Is it not? Sort of evaluate, that level of risk. And then even during the contracting phase, take a look at that organization, find out what they do for security training, what do they do as part of the ongoing, and put contract terms in there in your agreement that will help you manage those risks. Kind of put them on the same page as you in terms of a business associate contract or other things that, if there are breaches, they're going to be held really to the same standards as the covered entity as well. So, looking at medical devices, they do present some vulnerabilities. This slide, shows the FDA as well issues sort of similar to the FBI cyber notifications, and really they're just trying to make the healthcare organizations aware that these medical devices, in essence, are black boxes to the organization. You're not afforded that look inside them. In many cases, they're mini computers themselves. They're placed on the network in certain areas to really perform services for the healthcare organization, but sometimes people aren't necessarily looking at them from the aspect of, what do they have access to? Can they be used as a sort of a toehold into the network? And really, I think they're trying to the goal for this is to really try to impress upon the healthcare organizations to ask those tough questions, to ask these medical device manufacturers for a lot of their policies and practices around how they're maintaining these devices. How do they test these devices? There's been a lot of things in the news as well. The FDA issued a warning regarding some medical devices, an infusion system that was susceptible to being hacked, and if some of these are done, now you've brought these hacks into a whole other area, and that is in the patient safety area. So you've now gone from just getting at the information, putting an organization at risk just from an information loss point of view, to now through these medical devices, putting the covered entities and the healthcare organizations on the forefront for patient safety issues. So I think I'll turn it back to Jim at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I thought that last slide was interesting. I mean, those of us who know, it was the Hospira infusion system pumps that they said stop using those. The FDA recommended until a fix was implemented. You can only imagine what that did to that organization. Okay, I want to shift gears just a little bit here, and we are going to get to news you can use, so to say, because we are going to provide you 5 guiding principles that you could communicate up to your board. And we're going to talk a little bit about the role of IT, but before I do that, I want to talk about some of the recent breaches and settlement agreements that have happened. First, just some of the number of records that were breached. You can see on the slide here, these are some real good organizations that got breached. All the information I'm showing here is in public domain, so this is available to anybody. We're not disclosing anything here that's not already in the paper, but the point is showing you some of these names here, Anthem, Premera, UCLA Health, and Care First, Blue Cross Blue Shield, is that these are good organizations that have been that have been vigilant, and they still have been breached in that. So it's kind of come to a whole new level, and it includes everything from providers and payers. There's even a health information exchange company on the list, and you can see, take a look at the bottom there. One at Anthem had 78,800,000 records breached. Now, multiply that times the $398 we talked about before. This is a serious issue. Let's talk about these are some of where actually some settlements occur. And again, I'll remind you, it's the Office of Civil Rights that's assessing some of these penalties. And if you look at some of these are interesting. Santa Rosa Memorial, their estimated cost for the $34,000 record breach was $13.5 million. Is Concentra. 900 records were breached. Their settlement agreement was $1.7 million. And then Boston Medical, their estimated cost, they're estimating and reserving for a cost of $6 million. What's interesting about Boston is that was a third party, as Jim mentioned earlier, is these third parties that can cost us. We now have to be very concerned about the BAs that are being signed and following up and making sure that these third parties are also investing in appropriately in cybersecurity. So one last slide before we get into the 5 guiding principles, in that I think this last slide shows one small organization and one obviously very large organization, but Anchorage Community Mental Health Facility, 2,743 patient records were hacked. Their settlement agreement was $150,000. The reason that they were fined is that they simply didn't patch their systems. Right? So, as we all know, IT is fluid. Systems change. Their upgraded patches are made available all the time. They simply didn't patch the systems. In New York Presbyterian, that was $1.5 million fine in that. In New York Presbyterian and Columbia University Medical Center, the New York Presbyterian was an interesting one, because that was an application developed by a physician who went in and got onto the network, switched this out, and left personal information exposed. So because of the lack of technical safeguards, that resulted in some of this patient information getting out, and that the OCR doesn't take very kindly to. So look, it's not enough anymore just to have a set of procedures that you put on the shelf. It has to be enacted, and you have to prove that in order to avail yourself of the safe harbor provisions of that, which saves you substantially. So to keep it moving here, I'm going to get right on to the 5 guiding principles for the board of directors, since we really think that this is no longer just an IT responsibility. This is an organizational responsibility. So I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit of detail, but I'm going to go through it quickly in the interest of time. But the first one, the directors need to assume that, or need to understand an approach to cybersecurity, that it is in fact an enterprise-wide management issue, not an IT issue. And if I get into the specifics of that, go to the next slide, please. The principle 1, this shows a tiered line of defense. The first line of defense is, of course, the IT operations. You have to do the patches. You have to have written policies. The day-to-day monitoring has to occur. But the second line of defense is something that should be provided by somebody who is the head of cybersecurity. And I think prudent organizations are now having a person responsible for cybersecurity, and they would be the second line of defense. The third line of defense, of course, would be the internal audit organizations that looks and see, are the policies being implemented, are they being followed, and then, of course, the fourth line of defense is the leadership itself, to make sure that the senior management, and then finally the board. So that's principle number 1. I'm going to go to principle number 2, and we think it's very important that the board understand the risks associated with the third-party services, and that includes your partners, your payers, in some cases physicians that are literate from an IT perspective and that are working there. Cloud solutions themselves now, as more applications are going to cloud solutions, that needs to be considered. You need to make sure that the board needs to know, if you said SOC 1 and SOC 2 to our board, they'd think, is that something that you put on before your shoes? But we're talking about the service organization controls. SOC 1 focuses on the financial controls. Most audit committees are familiar with that. But SOC 2 focuses on the security and the ability and the integrity and the confidentiality of the privacy issues involved. So we think it's important that gets some board awareness. And we talked about the chain of trust, the agreements that cover your downstream organization. Are there practices in place to make sure that there's compliance there? Part of principle 2, we're talking about the legal implications. You need to understand what constitutes a breach, because get a load of this. It's different from state to state. And if you're an organization, if you're a healthcare system that's doing business in multiple states, as many of our customers are, the definition of what a breach is may differ slightly from state to state, and you just need to be aware of what that is. So. As part of that, we think that a board should be made. There should be a process to make the board aware of all major data breaches and security incidences. There's the Omnibus Rule of 2013 that talks about covered entities. And covered entities, as we all know, includes providers, payers, clearinghouse. That's the kind of the HIPAA definition of that. In the legal requirements. This goes back to this notion of we're held to a higher standard than other industries. We have to, without unreasonable delay or in no case later than 60 days following the discovery, make the publications that are required by law to be made out there. We don't have the luxury to do what eBay did and sit on that data for months and only worry about a reputation with your customers. So we also know the implications of this is that Health and Human Services post all large data breaches to our website, and any breaches, even a small one, has to be reported. But in this era of transparencies, where patients are looking at organizations, you don't want to see your organization on the website of an HHS thing that said, yeah, they don't really protect your data that well. There's so anyhow. The other portion of the legal implications, again, I'll just quickly mention that if you follow the practices, you can avail yourself of the safe harbor provision of the law. But that's getting harder and harder to avail yourself to, because they have changed the wording. It used to be you could kind of self-assess whether there has been, if there was a low probability that patient data was compromised, you used to say, okay, not a breach, I don't have to report it. Now they're saying, wait a minute, if these four things represented on the slide here you see are impacted, then you do in fact have a breach. So they're narrowing the definition. Let me go down to principle number 3. We want to elevate to the board level how important cybersecurity is, and we're advocating that the board take that. By the way, this isn't just I got to be honest. We got this information from the Institute of Internal Auditors Research Foundation, who published this, and we did get permission to share this with you today. So it's not just the collective opinion of CareTech; it's a collective opinion of what boards need to be aware from a cybersecurity perspective from the Institute of Internal Auditors Research Foundation. But what they're saying here on principle number 3. Board should take time to meet with the Chief Information Security Officer, and quite honestly, it's got to start with education. Board members need to know what we're talking about today. They need to understand the key issues from the security officer's perspective. Talk about the strategy and what kind of roadblocks are out there. Usually it's budgetary. Usually it's money. That's what one of the big roadblocks. But a lot of times it's a political agenda or worse, when there's an arrogance about this. No, we keep patches up to date. We're good to go. And I think a Chief Information Security Officer worth his weight or her weight would know it's not when you're going to, or if you're going to get hacked, it's when. We think it's important that the board knows that the CISO has relationship with the local authorities. Now, it's the last thing in the world that you'd think of, that a hospital employee would be calling the FBI saying, hey, let's sit down for coffee. But that's exactly where we are with these security issues. You should know and certainly be informed. Principle number 4 is to look at this from an enterprise-wide management framework. We think it's important that the board communicate this and make this an enterprise-wide awareness issue, and that the board should in fact make sure that the cybersecurity issue is funded well enough to accept the level of risk that they're willing to accept. Some of the more important questions are, what percentage is the IT organization funded well enough to do this work? How specifically, how many security dollars are being spent on this? Per employee, how many? And beyond the corporate information technology, what other departments maintain security budgets? And as Jim Hunter mentioned, you even now need to look at the people who handle the medical devices in hospitals need to be aware and have some security budget to do this. Principle number 5 is, again, we're starting with the principle that you cannot avoid being hacked. So meeting with the chief risk officer or whoever the equivalent for that organization is be aware of what risks are there. Your hospital might have enough money to say, listen, we made the decision to stay 2 versions behind on patches. And so with that going to come risk, and depending on what application that is, there'd be a risk that would go with that, and that should be discussed and known by the board. And then finally, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, is there enough insurance coverage now for these breaches, because they can be very, very costly. So, one of the things that people say is, well, do you really need a separate person for cybersecurity? Why can't it just be the IT? Why don't I put this on the IT department? Well, if you think of it this way, the person who builds your house is not the same person that's going to secure it. And in a sense, that's what we're talking about. So we want to arm you with some more information. So let me switch it back to Jim Hunter, and he's going to share with you the 6 questions that you might suggest that your board ask the organization relative to cybersecurity.
And thanks, Jim. These 6 questions really anyone could ask of the organization and should. We've got it targeted, from the board level, but it's really enlisting, the leadership and the board's help, because a lot of these issues, as we talked about a little bit earlier, it's not just an IT problem. It can't be solved by IT alone. I think a lot of organizations go through that similar pain of, just even vulnerability management. You're pushing patches to devices, you're doing things, but there's an immense amount of pressure from the organization side for limited to no downtime. So in some instances, all that work that IT is performing in terms of getting that patching out there and getting those service packs installed is really mitigated from the fact that the organization doesn't allow them the proper downtime to either recycle or reboot these devices to get those patches in production. So these sets of questions really are help to be defined to help the organization really understand from the top down why it is an organization issue, not just something that IT has to deal with. So, looking at those questions, does the organization have a security framework? What are the top risks in the organization related to cybersecurity? Are employees aware of their role in this, especially related to cybersecurity? And then really kind of looking at the threats, both internal and external, when you're planning those activities. And then is there governance set up within the organization to deal with security and security risks specifically? And then in the event of a breach, as Jim said, it's not a matter of if, it's unfortunately a matter of when. Is the organization prepared to manage those incidents when they come up? So kind of going into a little bit deeper dive for these. Question 1 about having the security framework. I think healthcare, everyone talks about the HIPAA, high tech, and high trust sort of healthcare centered frameworks. But I think one of the things that and we'll get into it in a couple of slides. One of the things I think the organizations struggle with that we see is if anyone's familiar with the PCI standards for dealing with credit card data. PCI has developed a really prescriptive framework for how to deal with the data, how to secure the data, sort of what tests they're looking for to allow an organization to be PCI certified. And so I think a lot of organizations find that while it's a painful process to go through the certification, it's a rather in-depth and intense framework. It's pretty simple to follow. They're black and white answers. There is no, we're going to get to it next year. It's either you meet the standard or you don't. I think organizations in healthcare overall do struggle with that same, where is that same guiding framework? Where is this idea of HIPAA compliant from a framework standard? And so one of the areas that we really centered on, NIST has created this cybersecurity framework that, while it's not specifically built for healthcare, we feel, especially in combination with PCI, can provide a great set of guiding frameworks for the organization to look at. And it really starts with just taking this risk-based approach. HIPAA does, and especially for meaningful use, there are some teeth in there that the government's inserted that they want you to perform these risk-based approaches to security. They want you to go through that risk analysis and conduct it on not just a one-time check-the-box basis, but on an ongoing basis to really go through that process of assessing all these potential risks. And then take those results and just don't put them on the shelf, but go back to that governance committee and really start to manage those risks. A lot of the risks aren't necessarily IT risks. They can be risks in the processes within the departments, the organization as a whole, and how it handles data, how it sends data to third parties. And so I think you need that governance committee formed and take a cross-section of the leadership. Put HR in there, put risk and legal in there. Obviously IT would be in there. Someone from the senior leadership, and really to show that these issues really aren't necessarily just the technical ones. It's the organization as a whole. But being active with those risks. Once you've identified them, what are you doing? Are you going to accept them? Are you going to mitigate them in some way? And that's definitely what they're looking for with this risk-based approach. As I mentioned earlier, this NIST created the cybersecurity framework, and again, it's not necessarily as targeted specifically to healthcare, but we feel just looking at what's out there, especially in combination with some of the others like PCI, that it's a pretty powerful set of framework. If you don't have any framework defined already for your organization, you're kind of struggling to get it going, and it really starts with those 5 areas that you see to the right that are bolded. Identifying either through the risk assessment or through other means. What are your risks? What are your assets? What are the things that are within your organization that you need to be concerned about? Sort of putting fences around each of those to figure out, do we even know what's on the network? Do we even know what's within our organization that are risks? And then from there, kind of working on the protection side of, what do we have, whether it's through training, whether it's through policy, whether it's through some controls, what can we do to protect a lot of the organization. And then detection, that's the biggest one. It's a lot of organizations don't even know, and I think when you read through some of these breaches, it wasn't just that it happened the week before it got noticed. It in some cases happened 6 months or a year before it got noticed. And so going through that process within the organization of really it's continuous monitoring, it's looking for evidence that someone's been in those systems that wasn't supposed to be. And then after that, really the framework sort of helps you set some response to that. What are you planning, how you respond to these, not only from a technical side, but from a communications side as well. And then how do you recover from these? In some cases, especially we've seen with these crypto locker and other sort of blackmail encryption type pieces of malware, they're trying to hold your data ransom. So in some cases, recovery of the data through your own internal means is the only way to get rid of it. And to mitigate it. So, the framework does a pretty good job at outlining these. We'll go into them pretty briefly. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time. I think, it makes for a great bedtime read if you can't sleep. But beyond that, I think everyone can go off, obviously, and take a look at this themselves. And it really starts just, from a high level. They have 3 main components. The first one's this framework core. And the core has sort of 5, security functions that we saw on each screen that they try to break down for each of these cores. You'll see it on the left where this one's identified. They create, obviously the arching category that they're going to talk about, and then there's over 100 subcategories. In this case, we've only listed 3 on this slide. But the subcategories are there really to start to reference. These are the best practices. There's a lot of standards listed there that you can go against, but they're very specific standards. So if you're looking for, what do they consider a best practice for, physical devices being inventoried, there's any number of those references that you could use to set a standard within the organization. And then they do tier it out. The framework begins to go through some tiers, especially on the risk side. And as you can see, it obviously starts with the lowest level at tier 1, where risk management is sort of ad hoc, and it might be really where a lot of organizations begin if they're not doing it today, all the way up to risk management really being embedded in the culture and being proactive, and that sort of puts organizations out at that tier 4 level. they do also introduce a concept of profiles, and so it's sort of the third major component for this framework. And it's just what we just described, that it uses those tiers as a way to sort of score an organization in terms of its current state, or really better yet, the target state of where you want to be with respect to implementing this framework core. And you can do this as part of the risk assessment, and you can also do it as just part of your strategic initiatives for cybersecurity in terms of kind of grading the organization. And then, we just listed some benefits. Obviously, this framework, as I talked earlier, I think what we see is a lot of organizations just struggle to find some framework that, we're kind of given these guidelines, especially around HIPAA, of what the expectation is as far as healthcare safety and security. But there really isn't that framework to match. And from our perspective, this is one of the better frameworks that we found to help an organization sort of work within that. And then, the second question, the top risks. Obviously, I think the one that we're seeing today the most, bring your own device. We're definitely seeing a merge between business and personal, and especially on the device front. You think of the things that you can install on your own devices. We're getting smarter devices, as Jim alluded to earlier. Even down to TVs now that have the ability to connect directly to networks. So. Really the organization needs to go through and kind of identify what those top risks. Third parties definitely being one of them. Insider risks, cloud computing, and then obviously the final one, the medical devices that we heard about earlier. And then, securing humans. This has become a concept really that it's not new. It's been out there for a few years. But it's really that continuous education of the employees within the organization and their role in cybersecurity. We found that's definitely one of the areas when you see these breaches, when you see these issues that come out, it can come back to simple phishing emails, things that someone fell victim to. And so kind of that annual and continuous security training and whatnot, and communicating out constantly to the employees around these issues really helps. And then looking, this chart kind of brings up kind of the leading causes and consequences for cyber crimes. Kind of getting back to that phishing email. If you go to that second line in there where it talks about the mechanisms used, social engineering, and email. So social engineering at 21%, and email at 17%. Really, a phishing email kind of combines those two. If you think about the reach from a hacker's perspective, they could potentially load hundreds of thousands of email addresses in there, attempting to get you to give up some information, either IDs and passwords, personal information. We've all seen those emails come through purporting to be from your bank or from UPS or from somewhere. And you think about the reach that they can get just with that one email, and if they can get a 5 or 10% success rate within that, how much information can they get from that? And then really, as we talked about earlier, forming that governance committee and really managing from a high level, as Jim talked about earlier, all those lines of defense, but bringing in all different areas of the organization on that governance so that everyone's aware, because not every issue, as we talked about earlier, can be solved necessarily through IT. Some of it has to be done through policies, procedures. Some of it has to be done even through all areas of the organization. And then as decisions are made with these risks, from that committee, you really want that 360-degree view of everything. You want sort of legal's opinion on it. You want HR's opinion on it, and risk, and all the various areas, just to make sure that everyone's in agreement on how to mitigate some of these risks. And then, this one we can't stress enough. It definitely gets back to that. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And really, do you have a response plan set up for these incidents? And more importantly, are you practicing them? It gets back to that adage of, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And this can't be any more stressed in this area than anywhere. That it's not just the IT response to these; it's as an organization as a whole. How we're going to communicate out to those impacted, whether they're employees, whether they're patients or clients, and then even from a communication standpoint, down to continuing to manage the crisis. crisis until it's resolved. and I'll leave you with the last one, just the overall responsibility of the board that they do have the responsibility of every board is to secure the future of that organization. You look at some of these breaches and things that were brought up earlier in the discussions, the dollar amounts attached to these alone are pretty staggering, and in some cases could very well wipe out some organizations. But then it's the secondary things. It's the impact to the reputation of the organization as a whole, and how do you put a measurement on that? Target, for instance, how many people have that now in the back of their head every time they're going through a cash register, every time they're thinking about making a purchase there, versus some other organizations. So, this just talks about the responsibilities to the organization and how it could impact it given these risks.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of wrap up this conversation by saying hopefully we've provided for you today a different way to look about security. We wanted to do it from a governance perspective. My orientation is from at the board level and that, but as Jim accurately pointed out, this equally applies to leadership at all levels in an organization. I think we're going to be talking more about cybersecurity. We just wanted to further that conversation with you this morning.